All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Prisma live stream. We are here today, Niko and I. My name is Ryan, and this is Niko, my colleague. We're here to talk about what's new in Prisma, what's new specifically in Prisma 2.6, which just landed this week. So if you haven't been here before, welcome. This is kind of a regular thing we're doing along with releases these days, where we talk about what's going on, what's new, and Niko and I kind of riff on some of our thoughts about Prisma and TypeScript and all that good stuff. And if you are joining us again from last time, welcome back. Thank you for being here. So yeah, Niko, I don't know, maybe for people who don't know us, people who are here for the first time, let's do a little intro about ourselves. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Nikolas. I lead the developer success team here at Prisma. And I also do these live streams. I occasionally write blog posts on our blogs, help out with documentation, really everything that helps people to use our tools better. What are you doing here, Ryan?
What am I doing? I'm working in DevRel, developer relations, and focusing on GraphQL quite a bit, but touching all the aspects of Prisma as well. So that includes things like, collaborating with the rest of the company on new stuff. It includes things like writing posts and doing talks and talking to the developers who use Prisma as well. So that is what I am up to. And today we are going to talk about some of the stuff that's new. We've got this 2.6 release that just landed on Tuesday. We've got a 2.6.1. There's a patch release that's gone in since. Some new cool features in that. We'll talk about what's new, including things like atomicNumberOperations, a much requested feature that is now in preview mode, and then some improvements to Prisma as well. We will talk a little bit about TypeScript 4.0, which just landed, and also TypeGraphQL, which is a library that helps you to build GraphQL APIs in TypeScript using some pretty cool features like decorators, and it gives a nice way to build a GraphQL API, and it's got some really cool Prisma integration as well. So yeah, 2.6 release. Niko, why don't you give us the high level? What's new in it?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I'll start sharing my screen for this one. And I wanted to say, actually, for our introductions, maybe a little bit of a quick add-on here. You're based in Canada, Ryan.
That's right.
Exactly, actually, where are you exactly? Where are you?
I am in Ottawa. Ottawa is the capital of Canada, and I am in kind of a suburb of Ottawa. So that's where I live, and
Very
Ottawa,
nice.
Ontario. Close to Montreal, where we have someone else at the company who's in Montreal, Jason, who I haven't met in person yet, but maybe once times are back to somewhat something that looks like normal, Jason and I will collaborate together because we're pretty close to one another.
Very cool. And what time is it where you are?
Right now, it is 11 a.m. And you're just finishing your day because you are in Berlin.
Exactly. I'm a little bit jealous, I have to say. I also would have been preferred taking this stream today in the morning. I had a pretty long day already with a lot of meetings and a lot of talking. So let's see how energetic I'm going to be throughout the stream. And I'm sure that once this is done, I'm going to call it a day.
I think it's a good idea.
Let's jump into the release. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And for a second, one second. Let me pull up the Prisma GitHub first. Share screen. And now you see a little bit of an infinite tunnel here, but this is what you want to look at. The 2.6.0 release, actually not the patch release, but the actual release. Ryan, is this readable? Or should I increase the font?
Bump it a bit there. I think maybe even one more, and you're good now, I think.
All right. There you go. So let's talk about the release and what we have been up to over the last 2 weeks. So first, the one feature that I'm pretty excited about is that we finally have a more robust introspection that keeps manual changes that you made to the Prisma schema file. So this was actually a major complaint that a lot of developers had since we released the beta version back in March, actually, because Prisma Migrate isn't ready yet, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware and still waiting for it. But this is why the recommended approach for using Prisma in production today is actually by doing migrations yourself using a third-party tool or just plain SQL, however you prefer running your migrations, and then generating the Prisma schema through introspection. The only problem with that approach is that introspection overwrites any changes that you made to your Prisma schema to kind of optimize your Prisma client API. Like part of this is, one second. I had a note here from my monitor that I needed to click away, but now I'm good again. Introspection overwrites the manual changes. For example, if you're using a @map or @map attribute inside of your schema, then this is going to be gone after you run introspect again. Or if you rename relation fields, which I think a lot of people are doing to have a more kind of ergonomic Prisma client API, well, tough luck, overwritten as well. But now with this new change in the latest release, these changes will be kept in the Prisma schema. Have you used introspection a lot, Ryan, or do you typically, for kind of the example projects that you're working on, do you typically use Migrate for those? Because you're not building anything for production, right?
Right. And so, yeah, it's typically been Migrate. So I've touched introspect just briefly. And maybe, you know, something that might be interesting for me and maybe for others too, is to like, just maybe if you could chat a little bit about what introspect versus Migrate, like how to think about that, maybe just really high level, the difference there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the big difference is that when you're using Migrate, then the Prisma schema really is the source of truth for your database and also for the models that you're using in your programming language, because both are generated based on the Prisma schema. So you write your Prisma schema and you map it to the database, and then you generate the client from it. Single source of truth is the Prisma schema. The big difference when you're using the introspection approach is that the database suddenly becomes your single source of truth where everything starts, because that's where you declare your schema in the first place using SQL create table statements, for example. And then you run introspection. This generates the models for the Prisma layer, and then you run Prisma generate, which in turn generates the models in your programming language. So I think the main difference is kind of where your single source of truth for your schema is sitting. And with Migrate, it's the Prisma schema. And with introspection, it's pretty much your database schema. And I actually prepared a little example that I want to show that shows how exactly this works. So I have my code right here. I have prepared everything. Right now, I'm still on the old 2.5 version of Prisma. So this is not yet with the new features, with the new, more robust introspection. And as you can see, my Prisma schema at the moment is empty. I just have a connection to a database here. And in fact, if we want to take a look at this, I also have that prepared right here in Postico. And we see that we have 3 tables: users, posts, and profiles. And let's see what happens when I now run Prisma introspect. It updates my Prisma schema as expected, and it pretty much translates these table definitions into Prisma model definitions. What I don't like about this is that the generated models, they don't really follow the naming conventions that we have for Prisma models. So typically Prisma models are spelled uppercase and in singular form. And that's because that just makes for a more natural way to query your data in the Prisma client API. So what a lot of people do to then adhere to these naming conventions and therefore optimize their Prisma client API, they just go and rename this. And how you can do this is actually by using the @map attribute, where you are mapping this model name to this table name in the database. So I'm doing the same for profile. Point to the profiles table underneath and to the users table underneath. And of course, I now also have to go and update the relation fields. So let's go ahead. Users is now called user, and profiles is called profile, and posts is called posts. I love my job here at Prisma because I'm really becoming an expert in building blogging applications.
Me too. Me too.
And so another thing that a lot of people want to do is also actually rename these relation fields. One thing to note about relation fields in Prisma is that these are fields that do not manifest in the actual database schema. So this users field here, for example, this you won't find an equivalent column in the database schema. If I'm looking at the post table in Postigo and at the definition, I don't really see a column that's called users. And that's because this is this field here purely exists on a Prisma level to make it easier to work with relations and in the Prisma client API, but also already on the schema level to understand better the relations between different models. So it's really like a matter of like more expressiveness and more clarity when it comes to working with relation. But if we look at the semantics of this model at the moment, then we kind of realize that the user's name doesn't make a lot of sense, because at the moment this is pluralized, and it's pluralized because it was named according to the previous model field that was users. But now it's called user, and this doesn't make sense because it's plural. So we certainly want to make a singular version out of this, but also to put a little bit more meaning to this field, I prefer just calling it author, because then it also maps with the author ID field that we actually have defined as a foreign key in the database. The same for profile. Here again, users is called user because it was named after the model that was previously called users. And this is actually correct. This is a lucky coincidence for us that posts and profiles, actually no, this has to be singular as well, but posts is already pluralized. So these kinds of changes people will want to make in their Prisma schema to optimize the Prisma client API. But the problem with this is that once you run introspection again, and remember I'm on the old version, I'm back to square one. And I can go and adjust it again now, and this is pretty much what you have to do after every SQL migration, after every change that you make to the Prisma schema that you want to pull it into, after every change that you make to the database schema that you want to pull into the Prisma schema, you'll have to go and make these manual changes again. And that's not fun. And there were a couple of community members actually who built scripts or small NPM tools that would help you with this workflow. But of course, ideally, we would be smart enough to just keep these kinds of changes. And so with the newest version, and I just quickly want to show that, and because I just do Command Z here and go back to the previous version, and we'll update Prisma to the latest 2.6.1 release. Guess I have to add the last dot here. Make sure that I delete, that also deleted the migrations folder, but I don't think that's a problem. Install dependencies again. This will generate the 2.6.1 version of Prisma Client and the Prisma CLI. And now if I run yarn Prisma introspect, all the changes are kept. And in fact, we even get this note here that the models were enriched with map information taken from the previous Prisma schema. So the introspection CLI even tells me what kind of manual changes it kept compared to the version from beforehand. So this is really nice. This is one big improvement, I think, for a lot of people who are currently using introspection, but who are still in a phase where they have to modify their database schema a lot. and then can do these manual changes and can be sure that they're actually being kept when they reintrospect the database again.
That's so cool. Are there any gotchas with it that you know of, that like maybe if people are using their Prisma model in a way that is not maybe, really typical, that they should be aware of?
Question. I'm actually not aware of anything that people should bear in mind. I hope that things just fall into place here. And to be clear, I also showed only a subset of what's possible here. So I only showed how this reintrospection now keeps the @@met attributes and also the changes to relation names. But there are a couple of more things that are also kept. So for example, the updated attribute, or if you make any comments to the Prisma schema as well, these comments will be kept as well. So a couple of things that don't manifest in the database. So one way to think about it is that before, in version 2.5, introspection really just looked at the database and wrote the Prisma schema into the Prisma schema file that it derived from the database schema. But now it first derives the Prisma schema from the database schema and then looks at the current Prisma schema to take over these manual changes and merges them into the new version.
Very cool. That's awesome.
All right. And then we have another one, atomic number operations on update. I think this is also something that a lot of people have been waiting for. Have you looked into this one already?
Yes, this is a very cool new feature because I think as you were chatting with me about prior to the stream, this used to be something that you had to do in multiple steps or have like some workarounds or resort to raw SQL to do if you wanted to do these kind of database level number operations, like math on your columns. If you have like integers or floats and you want to multiply or add or increment or whatever, this used to be something that was like not a very good developer experience. So I don't have a lot of familiarity with what it used to be like, and I think you're going to show what we used to do. But I know that the new API is great. It's the typical kind of Prisma syntax that you would expect in your Prisma clients, and just allows you to do things very easily.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what this also relates to actually is the question of transactions in Prisma client, because I'm sure a lot of folks will have followed this GitHub issue here, where there has been a lot of discussion and partially even like a heated debate around Prisma supporting long-running transactions or not, and all the different workarounds and fallbacks that we're offering. So if anybody is interested into that topic and how we're thinking about transactions in Prisma, then I definitely recommend you to just go to this GitHub issue and read through the entire history, because it really provides a lot of context. And the latest information was from Hervé that was posted. Hervé is our VP of product, and he kind of explained how we are thinking about long-running transactions, and in particular, the kinds of workarounds that we want to employ for now, because long-running transactions themselves, just like providing the same transaction mechanism that people might be used to when using plain SQL, is really something that makes it very easy for developers to shoot themselves in the foot. And in fact, that kind of transaction feature is also very often abused and also sometimes confused in terms of that people think they get a certain guarantee, but in fact they don't, or they run into a performance issue because they didn't understand that they were locking an entire table when they were running a certain transaction. So we're thinking about ways how we can prevent these kinds of confusions and bad practices and these traps basically for developers with proper APIs, more dedicated APIs that developers can use. And one of those is indeed the atomic number operations that we released as a preview feature in this week's release. So again, I'm starting in a very simple project with version 2.5 to quickly show you what this looked like before. Let me delete this part and also quickly open Prisma Studio because I'll use that to illustrate the changes that are happening to the database. Oh, come on. All right. I have a single post in here that has 4 views right now. And we're now back in Prisma version 2.5. So what if I wanted to send a single Prisma client query that is incrementing this number? Well, I had basically 2 options in Prisma 2.5. One of those is to use a raw SQL statement. Or actually, I'll start with the other option. I'll start first with the option where I already used the Prisma API, but I have to do it in 2 queries. So here's how you can do that. You could basically just retrieve the current number of views, right? You select a specific post with a find one query. This returns 1 object. And I say on this object, I actually just need the views property to quickly show you the model here. So it's a straightforward post model with a views property that is an int. And I'm just retrieving this. So current views at this point is an object that really has this 1 views property. Then I have to check if current views here to make the TypeScript compiler happy. And actually, I think then I should also be able to remove the question mark operator. And that's how you can do it. You send 2 Prisma client queries where you first retrieve the current value, and then you send another update query where you just add 1 to this current value. So just to convince ourselves that this works, I'm running the script, let's say 2 times. And back in Prisma Studio, I would expect that this now has 6 views. And that's exactly it. So that's one way of tackling it, but there were already people that weren't quite happy with that approach because, of course, you need 2 database queries, and that's not very efficient for a fairly simple operation. So what you could do instead is you could use the raw API of Prisma Client, and that looked something like this with the SQL that you had to write. So you could use the execute raw function that's exposed by Prisma Client, and then you have to write a little bit of SQL where you add this number to the views property. And again, if I run this 2 times, I would expect that in Prisma Studio, we are now at 8 views, and that's correct. But so we now saw these 2 options. The first option was with 2 queries. The second option was with a, well, SQL string that is probably not so fun to write. So let's see how we can resolve this in the latest release. I'm going to update again my version of Prisma to the latest one. Reinstall dependencies and regenerate Prisma client. And go back into the script and let's see how I can now achieve the same with the new atomic number operations. Prisma.post.update. Specify which post I want to update. There's just a single one with ID 1. And now I can select the views property, and because views is an integer, did I update everything correctly? Let's just make sure that I didn't mess anything up. The auto-completion didn't show the atomic number operator. I know why, because I commented it so out. So of course, it's still in preview, so I have to denote it here in my Prisma schema that I want to use this Prisma feature. I regenerate Prisma client, and now going back, let's see if I have to restart the TypeScript server or not. 50-50. I'll invoke the auto-completion. Hey, it's there.
This doesn't work. I find that I have to restart it like almost 90% of the time.
Me too. I was actually surprised that it worked here.
Yeah.
But that's the new API that you can use. So because views is an integer, it now exposes all these different operations that you can perform on integers. In this case, these are fairly simple kind of arithmetic operations. And if I run this with the yarn-def, let's follow what we did before, just run it twice, going back to Prisma Studio. And here we go with 10 views. So that's the new API, and I think that's a big step forward compared to what we had before. And of course, people might have more fields in their Prisma schema or more types where they might want to perform these kinds of atomic operations on. For example, you might want to concatenate strings. And that is something that you also want to do in an atomic operation that we currently don't offer yet. But these are the kinds of things that we'll now gradually add to the Prisma client API. And for the time being, you'll have to, unfortunately, accept the kinds of workarounds that I was showing before by either writing raw SQL if you really care about efficiency, or if you say, okay, it's not that important for me that I always have the most optimized database queries. In that case, you can also go and just send these two Prisma client queries that I showed in the beginning, where you first retrieve an object or the value that you want to update. And then in the second query, you just send an update query where you modify that.
Very cool. And it is only available on the update command, and that makes sense, right? Because
exactly,
you're gonna want to only operate on these numbers when you have existing data, right? That's the time that it makes sense to do so.
Exactly.
Yeah, cool.
I had one other interesting conversation today, actually, with another colleague who suggested that we could also provide a generic function here. So like something like, let's say this is update, and then we would pass in basically a function that takes the current thing, and then we could just update it here, like something like this. Of course, like this code won't work, but this could also be an idea of what the API could look like. And I actually really like that approach because it provides a lot of flexibility.
Sure.
The only problem with it is because, I mean, the reason why it's very flexible is because you could basically off the bat use it for any data type. So you don't have to wait for us to implement specific operations. But for example, if this was a string, then you could say, okay, string, and you concatenate it with like another string here, hello, or something like this, right? You would have all the flexibility to perform any operation you want, and you wouldn't have to wait for us to implement these specific operators. But the key here is that it's about the execution level. And if you write it like this, for sure, we could provide an API like this, but it wouldn't make the entire thing more efficient because after all, this would get executed on the TypeScript level and not on the database level. And the entire point of atomic operations is that you send one database query that is able to handle this for you. And in this case, that just wouldn't be fulfilled. So it's not the kind of thing that we want to do. But one thing, and that's the last thing I want to mention about this feature, is what we're considering is at some point, this is fairly far down the future, so please don't hold me to it yet. It's just like spitballing a couple of ideas that we are throwing around internally, is basically writing our own expression language. So like imagine this would be sort of a template string where you could now write a custom Prisma expression that expresses the operation that we could transform into an abstract syntax tree, which again, we could transform into the corresponding SQL query. So this is kind of an idea for a Prisma expression language that could be useful in this regard. And like not only would be applicable here, but for example, could also have use cases within a Prisma schema, for example, for data validation, where if we had this kind of expression language, you could also here do something like check. And then in here, you do like a Prisma expression, like X has to be greater than 0 because views always has to be positive. Something like this, but these would be kind of the use cases for a Prisma expression language that we might explore in the future. I don't want to promise too much here. If you like that idea, I don't think we even have a feature request for it. So if you really like it, then just go into GitHub and create the feature request for it.
That's cool, though. That's a good idea. Very nice.
All right. Yeah, that was a lot of talking. And I think that's also mostly it for this release.
Cool. Well, we can talk about TypeScript 4.0 now if you want.
Yes.
So I haven't really gone into detail about what's available with TypeScript 4.0. Maybe some of the viewers are more familiar. Maybe you can drop some of the features that are new that you like. I think that type inference has improved in TypeScript 4.0. There are some other new things there as well. And I think there has been something has landed in 4.0 that has helped out Prisma, which maybe you can talk about, Niko.
Exactly. And that's what we wanted to quickly discuss here on the stream, just to make people aware of this change. So since January, actually, we had this open issue here about hiding top-level client properties in the auto-completion. If you have used Prisma in earlier versions with TypeScript, then you might have noticed that when you're invoking the auto-completion on a Prisma client instance, that you not only see the top-level Prisma client methods like connect and disconnect, and not only the properties that represent the queries for your models like comments, but you also get a lot of stuff that you probably don't really understand what it's being used for. Things like connection promise, DMMF, engine config, these kinds of things you won't even find in our documentation because, as a matter of fact, they are implementation details. And in our Prisma implementation, they have been declared as private properties. But there was a bug in TypeScript that exposed these private properties to the auto-completion in VS Code. And in the latest TypeScript release, as Joel pointed out here, so he pointed to the bug in TypeScript IntelliSense. And in the latest TypeScript 4.0 release, this bug has been fixed, which in turn just resolved the issue for us. So from now on, you will see the right properties and only the right properties that you can invoke. And another cool thing that also came with this release is that when certain methods are marked as deprecated, they also show up as being strike through in the auto-completion. So connect, disconnect, and execute raw and on. 2 releases ago, we introduced this version where you have to prefix those top-level client methods with a $sign. And we deprecated the old ones, so you are still able to use them, but sooner or later you'll have to switch over to the $prefixed version. So that's also new in Prisma client, in the new version of Prisma, but only because that bug in TypeScript was fixed and TypeScript 4.0 has been released.
Very cool. I am looking forward to digging more into TypeScript 4.0 as well to see what else is new in there. So I will let you know what I find. And I think someone who's been talking about the 4.0 release is Ben Awad. He is someone that maybe lots of us know on Twitter, on YouTube. He's got a very big YouTube channel where he creates lots of tutorials and has a lot of opinion videos as well about the web development industry, I suppose. Perhaps you could talk a bit about this exercise you went through where you took the project that he did in this gigantic tutorial that he put up, which used a lot of the things that many of us love, like React and TypeScript and GraphQL. He used TypeORM as his database layer in his tutorial. And you went through and took a look at what you can do to basically take out TypeORM and put in Prisma. So maybe talk a bit about that.
Absolutely. And I really love the transition that you made here. I had exactly the same transition in mind that Ben actually also posted a video about TypeScript 4.0, and it was perfectly on point, Ryan. Very nice.
Very good. We're well coordinated.
So, well, in fact, I also watched at least the beginning of his video, and already the introduction really made me laugh out loud in this case. well, I actually quoted it in a tweet of mine that, and like what he said in the beginning of this video is, if you're still using JavaScript, I've got nothing than respect for you. You're playing web dev on hardcore mode. You've got friendly fire mode off. If you want to shoot yourself in the foot, you can shoot yourself in the foot. And I think that's just like very accurate. You're just like, you don't have any security measures on what you're doing, and you're just in a very kind of risky area if you're using plain JavaScript. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about his project. He published this 14-hour gigantic tutorial where he built a Reddit clone pretty much from scratch. And as you explained, I went through an exercise of migrating the tutorial that he built with TypeORM, migrating that to Prisma. And in fact, I used kind of the incremental adoption approach for this. So I first kind of cloned his repo. I made it work on my machine. I had the entire application running. And then I thought, okay, what does it feel like to now gradually replace TypeORM with Prisma client? So I went in there, I started with introspection, I generated my Prisma client, and then I, one by one, looked at the database queries that he made with Prisma client, with TypeORM, and adjusted them to use Prisma client. And the results can be viewed here in this Git diff that I want to show to everybody now, that shows kind of the difference between TypeORM and Prisma. So here are just a couple of config files that are being exposed. This is the ORM config file that's used for TypeORM. So that, of course, got removed as well in the transition. There also was a leftover in the package.json for microORM, some configuration, because I actually think that Ben started building the app with microORM and only then switched over to TypeORM. But the dependencies that were switched out were basically, I removed the PG driver because that's not needed anymore, as well as the TypeORM dependency here, and added the Prisma CLI and client dependencies. Then, of course, we're adding the Prisma schema, and in turn, we can remove the migrations that are a little bit further down, I think, in this Git diff. We'll see it later. And now we come to the exciting part where we basically just delete a lot of existing code. So one thing that I really noticed with this migration is how much less code I had to write using Prisma client compared to what it was before with TypeORM. So here, for example, this is the entities post file. And because Ben was using TypeGraphQL, and in fact, like TypeORM and TypeGraphQL, they play nicely together because they both follow the decorator approach. So you would define your models as classes once, and then using the TypeORM decorators, you can turn them into database models, into database entities. And using the TypeGraphQL decorators, you can turn them into GraphQL types. So in fact, I think this is probably one of the best approaches for building really solid TypeScript GraphQL APIs to this date. But I think we'll also later talk about the Prisma TypeGraphQL integration. And I think with that, you get to a similar level of convenience. But let's just go through here and check a little bit what has happened. So here we just note that we can delete all of the decorators from our model classes, because now these model classes really are only relevant for the GraphQL, for the TypeGraphQL layer to define our GraphQL types. I could entirely delete the updude model. Updude is Ben's model that stores votes on post. For the user model, I just did the same. I removed all the TypeORM decorators and just was left over with a pretty slim TypeGraphQL class, basically, that just defined my type. And then in index.ts, I could also delete a bunch of code. So all of that I didn't need anymore. I also was able to delete the data loaders that Ben created for his models. Because the data loader is built into Prisma client and I don't have to explicitly use it myself. So that's also really nice. The only thing that changes here when defining the GraphQL schema is that I attach Prisma client to the context, and we can remove the user loader and the upload loader right here. Here is where I deleted the migrations because we now use Prisma. We don't need those anymore. And let's take a look at a couple of queries. So let's take maybe this one as an example. So this is the vote query, where the functionality of this is that you send a vote mutation, actually. And in there, what Ben does, he creates this updo model that stores a vote for a particular post by a particular user. And there is a little bit of logic required to make this query happen, where Ben used a transaction to first update the updo model and then update the post respectively. And the difference between the two here is that like, first of all, what Ben does, he creates the transaction here, and then he writes plain SQL using TypeORM and sends this to the database. And with Prisma, you can do the same, but in a very type-safe way. So we don't have the SQL strings here, but instead we just create these operations. And one thing to note about this actually is that this will return a promise that is not yet resolved, right? I'm not using await here. So this is not executed immediately, but rather this operation one here, this constant, just stores an unresolved promise. And the same for operation two. Also, no await. So again, this is an unresolved promise. And to resolve those, I'm now using Prisma's transaction mechanism that is going to run both operations immediately, one after another. And then after that, we have pretty much the same logic, but just for the case where a user has never voted before. And I think that pretty much all in all, you can look through this and you'll find that a lot of the queries now look a lot more natural, and it just feels a lot cleaner overall with just a consistent API that I'm repeatedly calling when I need to send database queries to a database.
I've got a question on dollar transaction. I haven't really touched that much. So what's the what's the implication there? Maybe you could even scroll back up. So, I think the idea that Ben's getting after here when he's running this transaction is he wants to make sure that the first operations will be successful before committing the final operation. Which
exactly,
and that's what you get out of the dollar transaction from Prisma as well. Like if those op1 and op2, if those were to fail for whatever reason, they'd be rolled back, kind of like the whole thing would be rolled back.
Exactly. So the point of this transaction is that it might be that if this wasn't wrapped in a transaction, that this SQL query succeeds, but then for whatever reason, the second one doesn't succeed. And this would bring the data into an inconsistent state in the database. And the developer is responsible for that. The developer at this point is responsible to make sure that either both of these queries succeed or none of them does. And the way how you do that in a traditional way when working with databases is that you wrap it in a long-running transaction. And this in TypeORM looks like this, that you define this transaction like this, and then you write the query here. In Prisma, as we already discussed today, we don't support these kinds of long-running transactions, and instead we want to build dedicated APIs that people can use for their specific use cases. And one use case is simply to batch operations and send a batch of operations to the database where you can be sure that either all of them or none of them succeeds. So if I now use the Prisma API here and use the transaction mechanism that we provide, I can be sure there is a guarantee from Prisma that either both of these operations succeed, or if for whatever reason operation 2 is going to fail, then operation 1 is going to be rolled back as well. So that's kind of the idea behind this transaction top-level client method.
Very, very cool. Yeah, that looks a lot more ergonomic. Like I'm looking at the diff and I'm like, yeah, the right side feels, I mean, maybe we're both biased, Niko, in some way or another here. There's a possibility of that, but no, like it feels, the ergonomics of it to me, like just look better.
Sure.
Okay, so do we want to talk about type GraphQL now?
Yes, that was a lot of talking from you. I am happy to
take
hand it over to you.
You take a break. You have well-deserved a break. All right, so maybe if you could pop my screen onto the share
Definitely. There you go.
All right, so type GraphQL. There's a lot of people who are familiar with this project. If you're writing GraphQL servers and you want to do so in kind of a type-safe way where you get generated things for you, you want to use TypeScript and all these features from TypeScript, like decorators. Type GraphQL is one way to do that. Another way, if you're familiar with Prisma, and maybe you know about Nexus, and Nexus gives you a type-safe GraphQL API in a code-first way. What that means is instead of writing schema definition language and then your resolvers separately, you kind of write all of that together just as code. And it's a bit cleaner. Like you don't have to switch back and forth between SDL and code for your resolvers. You get to do all that stuff in one shot. So type GraphQL is pretty popular, and there is now a generator that is available to make it working with Prisma super easy with type GraphQL. So I've got this post type here. Again, I am making a career out of writing blogging applications, just like Niko is, and we are decorating it with object type, which will then be fed here into this resolver. This resolver decorator is going to give us a way to write a resolver for that type. And when we put it all together with build schema, we can then start up an Apollo server. And in fact, if I come over here and hit play, we've got these two posts, these two hard-coded posts right here. So that's cool for hard-coded data, or if you want to, do something here, if you're in the your method and you want to go, fetch from database, whatever, and then return your data. So that's cool. That's something you can do. But if you are working with Prisma and you are wanting to work with your Prisma model like this, for example, where you've got a post, this whole process becomes quite a bit easier. And so why don't we take a look at how it becomes easier. I have installed something called TypeGraphQL-Prisma. So in the package.json file here in the dependencies, I've got TypeGraphQL-Prisma, currently at 0.6 for the version. And if I put in some configuration here, if I put in a generator for type GraphQL and then give it the provider, just the name of the package there, and then an output, what I can do when I now do my Prisma generate is I can get this generated directory here that has a ton of cool stuff. And in particular, what you'll find in here is a whole bunch of stuff that is automatically generated code, which gives you basically a GraphQL API that maps up to your resource that you've created. So in this case, I've got all of these CRUD operations that are available now simply by having a single model in my Prisma schema. And what this looks like in practice, if I wanted to start to make use of this, I've got this SQLite database here, dev.db. If I wanted to make use of this, I can actually go in and take this, let's find it here, this one right here, post CRUD resolver. This is going to give us a ton of cool stuff. Let's go into server.ts, and then up at the top, I'm going to import post CRUD resolver from /generated and then type GraphQL. And then down where I'm making my schema, where I'm building my schema now, instead of including post resolver, I'm just going to replace that with post CRUD resolver. And let's just make sure that the server did its thing. Looks like it restarted. If I now, I'll just refresh for good measure here. If I now take a look at the docs, I've got all of these queries and mutations that were auto-generated for me. So I can hit that same query, right now I've got no posts, but if I do a mutation, I do create post, give it some data, I can give it the title that it's looking for, and I can give it a body. And then we can get back the ID, the title, the body if we want to. We hit go. There we go. We've got a post. Put in another one. And then we do a query again for posts, post plural. Get ID, title, and body. And hit go on that. There we go. We've got data coming from our database. And that was pretty cool because I literally, to get that API stitched up, I just started with this simple model and it was all generated for me. So, you know, that's cool for a lot of cases. Like that hits a lot of use cases where if you want to do CRUD operations and you're not so particular about like your model having sensitive data, that, you know, it can be really valuable in that way. You might have to make your own resolvers though if you don't want to resolve out certain fields like passwords, for example. If you got like user models and you've got passwords stored there, you don't want to make those available to your GraphQL API. But all that to say, ton of work that's done automatically for you by opting into this TypeGraphQL Prisma provider. And there is something similar for Nexus. We do something similar where you can generate your CRUD operations and get the same kind of CRUD ops that you would with TypeGraphQL. Different options here. Have a play with it. Let us know what you think. And curious, Niko, about your thoughts about TypeGraphQL now that you've kind of explored this further.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really nice tool, and it probably depends a little bit on kind of what your preferences are in terms of how you like to work with TypeScript. And I think it also depends on what your background is as a developer a little bit, because the decorator approach that TypeGraphQL uses, I think is also fairly common actually in the Angular community, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't worked with like Angular, but like that's what I kind of am aware, I think. And also, for example, in the Nest.js community, which I think is also fairly tightly coupled to the Angular community. So I think for people from these communities, TypeGraphQL will feel like fairly natural because it uses a lot of the same kind of patterns. And I think even that in Nest.js, TypeGraphQL is one of the most popular ways of building a GraphQL API for Nest when you're building your backend with the Nest.js framework. So yeah, super exciting stuff. And what we are focusing on, of course, with these kinds of tools, like we want to make it as easy as possible for everybody who builds an API, whatever tool they're using, might be TypeGraphQL, might be Nexus, even SDL first. Or if it's just the REST API, like we want to build these kinds of integrations that leverage the information from the Prisma schema in order to already generate code for you that you would have to write anyways on your API layer. And of course, there are more questions when it comes to authorization and things like this, and we'll figure these kinds of things out over time. But what these kind of tools and integrations are certainly already very useful for is actually prototyping. I mean, you saw how quickly you came to a point where you had a full-on GraphQL CRUD API, and it would have been like virtually no effort to add more queries and mutations. You could have done this just in a matter of seconds or minutes to have a full-blown CRUD API for your database. And I think, especially during prototyping stages, that's exactly what you need. So I'm super excited about this kind of work, and we'll see where it's headed and which tools and libraries we're going to pick next to build integrations for.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm pretty jazzed up about it as well. So there is you dropped some links there in the chat, I see. Yes. Did you want to talk about the maybe the Hacker News article or the thread?
Yeah, I'll once more very quickly share my screen, and I think we're already very close to wrapping up this session today. So I just want to quickly plug two two things that are currently interesting in the community. So the first one is a Medium blog post that was published just yesterday by Nick McHenry. Maybe some of you already have seen it, maybe not. Okay, this is not what I wanted to do. Wait, am I screen sharing already?
Oh, yeah, I see it.
Okay. It's getting late here. I'm sorry. So this is the article. It's really a practical comparison of Prisma and TypeORM. And I think especially if you're a TypeORM user, this is going to have a lot of really good information for you. And it's by no means a comparison that just favors Prisma, but it's very kind of high level and objective. And that's what I really like about it. And it's also very practical in that it compares different workflows and explains with code snippets what these workflows look like. So for example, here's the section that talks about how to set up Prisma and how to set up TypeORM on the other hand. And it kind of shows you the first steps that you need to take with either tool in order to get something like a simple setup going. And then Nick continues in that kind of manner by just looking at the different kinds of queries and comparing the API that's being provided. So for Prisma, he explains that this is how you do this query with Prisma, and then kind of showing the same for TypeORM. And that's how he approaches the entire article, just comparing the two, putting them side by side, and explaining how the API differs, and illustrating this with very nice examples. So I'm a big fan of this article, and I think especially, as I said, for TypeORM users, this is going to have a lot of really valuable information for them to look into. At this point, I also quickly just want to point out that we have actually something fairly similar in our docs. In our docs, we have this section that's called API comparisons. And this is where we do pretty much the same, but not as detailed as Nick did, where we just put the APIs of Prisma and different other ORMs next to each other. So here we have the same comparison with TypeORM, but also, for example, with Sequelize, we can just scroll through and understand how the Prisma API differs from the ones provided by other ORMs. That is one thing, and now coming to the last thing is there currently is a Hacker News thread about a new TypeScript ORM that was released that looks actually very interesting. And of course, whenever a new tool is out on the market that is related to us, we just have our eye on that and like want to look for inspiration and want to see how people compare it to Prisma. So if anybody who's currently watching this wants to chime into this Hacker News thread and kind of share their experience with Prisma and how they feel it compares to other tools from the Node.js and TypeScript database space, then you're very much invited to share your thoughts and opinions. Whether that's in a positive or negative way, of course, we take any sort of criticism there. These kinds of threads, I think, are just always super interesting to just follow and see how people think about database tools.
Yeah, that's really cool. Cool. Well, we're pretty much at time, so I suppose we should wrap it up. Yes. Any other thoughts before we do? I don't think I have any, but if you got any other recommendations or thoughts, feel free.
Not really. I'm a bit sorry that we weren't really able to pick up any questions today, so I quickly scroll through them. I see that there are was a little bit of activity in the chat. I just want to give a shout out to Smolebrut, however that is pronounced, who noted that I'm drinking Club Mate here. So shout out back. But yeah, feel free to drop your questions on Slack or on GitHub, and we'll try to follow up there. But that was it for today.
Awesome. Cool. Well, you have a good rest and rest your voice up. You've been talking all day. So I'll catch you tomorrow, I guess.
All right.